We're coming on the air with breaking news. Just moments ago, Ryan Routh, who was found guilty of attempting to assassinate Donald Trump, the president, during the 2024 presidential campaign, was sentenced to life in federal prison. In September, Routh was convicted, you may recall, on 5 counts tied to trying to kill then-candidate Trump at his West Palm Beach golf course. You may remember Routh tried to stab himself in the neck with a pen after learning that guilty verdict. Let's go to Aaron Gilchrist, who's been following the case and following today's developments for us. Aaron, we knew that prosecutors were seeking that life sentence, and it appears that's what they got.
Yeah, absolutely. Prosecutors said that the most important of the 5 charges that Ryan Routh faced, the attempt to kill a major presidential candidate, the one that carried that life sentence, is the one that really should guide Judge Cannon's decision-making in this sentencing process. And now we see that that was, in fact, the case. I'm told by our producer who was in the courtroom during the proceedings that lasted roughly an hour or so, that Ryan Routh was given the opportunity to make a statement prior to this sentencing, and the statement was described as nonsensical. He brought up things like Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the fight with Hamas, between Hamas and Israel. These were things that were a part of some statements that Routh had made in the past in representing himself during the course of the trial. I was in the courtroom for the closing arguments back in September, and I can tell you from just listening at that time that there were many statements that Ryan Routh made that did not seem at all to apply to the case that was in front of the judge and the jury here, and things that were nonsensical. The judge exercised a lot of restraint of herself, I think, during those closing arguments that I listened to, where she would admonish Routh for saying things that were not related to or in order for this sort of a legal proceeding. But she gave him a lot of latitude, too, to make the arguments that he wanted to be able to make. And in her sentence today, I'm told that the judge really did not hold back in talking about Ryan Routh, describing him as an evil man and saying that she had no doubt that his intent was to kill a presidential candidate in this instance. And so today, the word that we've gotten from the courtroom is that Ryan Routh will spend the rest of his life in prison. There are some additional years added to that for some of the other charges that he faced as well, Kate.
Aaron, thank you, Aaron. I want to go to a press conference that's going on right now. This is the attorney for Ryan Routh. Let's listen in.
Conclusions. I just disagree with them. I think Ryan is a remarkable person. I think he did things that most of us would never even think to do. So, for example, for him to go to Ukraine and volunteer to join the front lines and be a soldier to fight against the Russian invasion, how many people would do that? And what does that say about his character? And then after he left, he went back. And I have received and I have filed letters from people Ukrainians who met him in Kiev, who saw how scarce the resources were that he had, how difficult it was for him to live there, and how hard he tried to recruit and bring combat experienced veterans to come and support the Ukraine defense of their country. How many people would go to Taiwan and try and offer NATO-trained Afghan commandos to go in and help defend that country against a potential Chinese invasion? There are letters in the court, and there are stories about all the kind things that Ryan did. The court was focused on the offenses of conviction. So I understand that. I think we have a great federal judiciary in this country. I think the judge may have mistakenly applied the federal crime of terrorism enhancement, and that will be probably the leading issue on appeal. I will be filing a notice of appeal in this case. Thank you.
What about that supervised release, Mr. Routh? What does that mean for...
Excuse me?
Will you be appealing?
Yeah. What does supervised release mean when the judge was referencing that? When might that kick in, or under what circumstances might that be applicable to him?
That is a required pronouncement by the judge, but generally, if you serve life in prison, that's life. There's no parole in the federal system. So he would never actually have an opportunity to serve a period of supervised release.
How is his family taking the news? I saw the sister in court today with us in her hands.
His sister is a very intelligent, professional person. I think she expected to have a very difficult outcome today, and she took it very well.
The judge seemed, safe to say, exasperated when your client was trying to read his remarks. I think for her, it seemed, by her own remarks, to echo a little bit of the disjointed nature of his own case presentation. Well, why did you, what are your thoughts about that moment and allowing your client to take that moment to speak to the judge in the remarks?
Well, you can imagine you find yourself in this position as a lay person with no legal training, having gone through a trial where you were convicted, acting as your own lawyer, and doing a lot of things wrong, not following procedure because you don't know them, not knowing how to introduce exhibits into evidence, not knowing the proper way to cross-examine people or undermine their credibility, and being constantly, I guess, criticized and corrected for his inadequacies as a lawyer. So my thought is he has consequences to pay, and this was his day to say everything and get it off his chest. I didn't want to put any limitations on him.
He said something about wanting to be in an assisted suicide situation. How do you think he's going to go over the field and visit? How do you think, mentally, or how do you think he'll relate? How do you think
we'll just have to wait and see. I don't really know.
No remorse, no regret. The government said it. The judge, I don't know that the judge referenced it when she was giving the sentence, but has there ever been a moment of remorse or regret?
I think I addressed that in court as much as I could. I'm sorry.
About his inability to understand the federal rules of criminal procedure. Is that part of the appeal that you like to have?
Most definitely. I don't think he was qualified or should have been allowed to act as his own counsel at the trial.
Mr. Routh said in his allegation that violence was not to be accepted, but yet the judge just sentenced him where she said crimes were cruel and then repetitive. How do you square up those?
I think what Mr. Routh was trying to do was he was trying to tell people that might be influenced by him that political violence is never helpful. It's harmful to the democratic process. And I think he was renouncing the thought that a political assassination is ever appropriate.
Mr. Routh was renouncing that?
I think he was.
All right. We've been listening there to Martin Routh. He is the court-appointed attorney for Ryan Routh. You heard him talking about when Mr. Routh was representing himself prior to his appointment. I want to flag that that is the attorney for the defendant. If you had been in the courtroom, we're getting notes now about what happened inside. The judge, Judge Aileen Cannon, when she made this sentence of life in prison, spoke words that were pretty harsh about Mr. Routh. She said, "It is clear to me, Mr. Routh, that life imprisonment is reasonable." She called what he did an evil plot and said, "The evil is you." Let's go to Aaron Gilchrist, who's been following this for us. Aaron, there were a lot of words in the courtroom that we're just now getting a read on. Tell us more about what happened inside as this sentencing came down.
Yeah, Kate, I think you alluded to what happened in court today in terms of the judge in this case really saying out loud all the things that she didn't say and perhaps wanted to say during the trial where Ryan Routh was representing himself and so often talked about not having the mental capacity to commit a crime. He did not shoot Donald Trump on the golf course that day. He made the argument that because he did not do that, that he shouldn't be found guilty. It was something that, of course, prosecutors swatted down time and again, saying that Ryan Routh had planned and plotted to assassinate a major presidential candidate and had gone through all the steps just short of pulling the trigger to make that happen, and therefore he should be found guilty, which he was by that jury of his peers there in Florida. The judge also, as you noted, Kate, taking time to point out that she noted that he really talked about topics that were not related to his case, that were not related to his trial, things going on in geopolitics around the world. That happened again today through the course of the comments that he was allowed to make before the judge cut him off today, which she did several times during the closing arguments as well, again, because he was making those remarks that were not related to what was happening there. It's worth noting that the judge did acknowledge that she had received letters from members of Ryan Routh's family who were in the courtroom at different points during this process, letters saying that he was a good person. He tried to present witnesses that would make that same argument, those letters going on to say that he was a person who could be rehabilitated as well. Obviously, Kate, in this case, the judge decided that, as you noted, this was a crime that he was found guilty of that was too serious to not impose the maximum sentence that she could on the most serious charge of trying to assassinate a presidential candidate, Kate.
Aaron, thank you so much. I want to bring in trial attorney and NBC News legal analyst Misty Maris, who followed this entire case. Misty, it is interesting. The defense, Routh's attorney, had asked for 27 years rather than life in prison, and also mental health treatment while he is in custody, which is something I think that has been an underlying current in this entire trial, right? This idea that perhaps this man needs mental health treatment.
Yes, Kate. So what the defense was asking for was a downward departure from the sentencing guidelines and what was recommended by probation, asking for that 27 years. And what the defense needs to do to support that request is to lay out what are called mitigating factors. And those are some things the court can take into consideration. One would be Routh's age. Another would be whether or not there are mental health issues, which was again raised in this hearing today on sentencing. Another issue that was raised by the defense, that this was an attempt crime. So all of those things were laid out by the defense in order to support a downward departure. Of course, the judge did not agree. Other factors, what prosecutors present, are what are called aggravating factors. Why is this serious? Why does this warrant the highest penalty under the law of life imprisonment? And they really spoke about the nature of the crime and the premeditation. So all of that to say, Kate, I think what we see from the defense is teeing up what will likely be an appeal. The focus of that appeal, likely mental health issues, was the decision to allow Routh to represent himself right from the get-go. Legal competency, was that an error? That's what you can expect in the appellate case, which will raise those critical issues that you just set out.
Yeah, in fact, when we were listening in to Martin Roth, the attorney for Mr. Routh, he was very clear. He said, we are intending to appeal. And he actually called out the judge and said that he thought, in his opinion, the judge was misreading the ability to impose a life sentence. Can you explain, Misty, why he was questioning that, and what is the legality here in terms of sentencing?
Yes, so what prosecutors asked for was a sentencing enhancement, and it's called a terrorism enhancement. With that enhancement, the severity of the sentence is much, much higher. That is something that leads to this life without the possibility of parole in the federal system. So in order to establish the terrorism enhancement, prosecutors need to say and show that Routh's intent was to coerce or influence the government through force or intimidation. So that's the standard. And what the defense is saying is that they fell short of establishing that threshold based on the facts that were laid out, specifically relating to this being an attempt crime. You know, the defense had argued in pretrial motions that Routh was there to protest, that he still proclaims his innocence, that he was not there to attempt to commit a murder. So all of that is what the defense will likely argue on appeal. Of course, the judge, and, you know, I followed this entire trial. There is a bevy of evidence of premeditation in this case that resulted in the guilty verdict, and is clearly also something that the judge took into consideration with sentencing. But a lot of that life sentence hinges on the application of that terrorism enhancement, which makes the penalty more severe when applied.
And Aaron, back to you just briefly. We haven't heard anything just yet from the White House or President Trump, right?
We have not, Kate. I don't believe we've gotten any word yet on that. We do know that right after the sentence, rather the guilty decision was handed down, President Trump did weigh in and say that he thought it was an appropriate decision for the jury to have made, that he was proud of the prosecutors who worked on this case on his behalf, obviously. And so I would expect that if we hear something from the White House, it would be in the same vein, that the president believed that Ryan Routh was definitely, obviously, guilty of the charges against him, and that he supported the decision that came from the jury in this case, Kate.
Aaron, thank you. And Misty, just finally to you, what will be next for Mr. Routh? Will he immediately go straight to prison?
Yeah, so he is now being held in a Miami prison. Now he will be turned over to the Bureau of Prisons. It's likely, given the nature of this crime, the nature of his conviction, that he will be in a maximum security facility. Now, the Bureau of Prisons takes over from here, and there will be input from the defense. There could be input from the judge as to what type of facility he will be in. I expect that there will be a request that there be mental health treatment or the ability to get some mental health services at whatever facility he goes to. But given the nature of this crime, it's very likely he'll be transferred to a high security prison. And of course, that does not need to be in Florida. That can be anywhere in the United States.
All right, Misty Maris, thank you. And again, just to recap for those joining, Ryan Routh has been sentenced to life in prison. Ryan Routh had been convicted of attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate in Mr. Trump. We'll have much more ahead here on NBC News Now and online at NBCnews.com. And I'll see you back at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Kate Snow. We return you to NBC News Daily.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.